Good morning. I think what's expected of a chair is usually what the French were taught to expect of their children, which is you should be seen and not heard. So I won't say much at this juncture other than to say that it's a great privilege to introduce this panel and this theme. I think it's fair to say that this is the panel, one panel in this conclave that is in a sense going to set the tone for the deliberations that follow, in part because it is going to ask the question of the brave new world or what the future is going to look like at a very sort of macro level. And we have two distinguished speakers who I think if you were to pick any two speakers in the world to answer some of the questions that our future raises, I think we could not have done better. The premise of this panel, I think it's fair to say, was set by some of the work Professor Francis Fukuyama did, particularly his famous book, The End of History and The Last Man and the End of History. And he put forward the hypothesis, and I stress the word hypothesis, that in some senses the ideological evolution of mankind was nearing completion with the ineluctable triumph of capitalism and democracy. And that this twin combination of capitalism and democracy would not only beat out rival ideological systems, in some ways it would actually answer to some of the fundamental aspirations of human nature in terms of the quest for freedom, in terms of the quest for mutual recognition. And it raised the specter that while there will be small challenges here and there, perhaps the biggest problem the world might have to face is more boredom and voter apathy than serious ideological conflict. So the first question, in a sense, is to what extent has that prognosis about the march of democracy and capitalism and the forms that that combination will take come true? The second premise was that globalization was also going to fundamentally alter the nature of great power politics. If you look around the world today, you see two processes at work simultaneously. On the one hand, we have a world that is economically very interdependent, and all the great powers are locked into very delicate relationships of interdependence with other great powers. On the other hand, there is the parallel specter, that all the great powers still continue to upgrade their nuclear arsenals. All the great powers still continue to seek bases around the world. And there is, in a sense of geostrategic and military competition that parallels this rise of independence, rise of interdependence. The question is this form of great power politics merely a shadow play, a kind of holdover from the past? This is the way states are used to thinking and they will continue to think. But it will have no real repercussions on the fundamental dynamics of interdependence in the global economy. And this question becomes even more urgent as the balance of power shifts. We already have one sort of dominant power in the world, which has a great sense of its own civilizational mission, a great sense of entitlement, and one could argue a great capacity to misjudge its own power in the world. Imagine what the world would look like if the new emerging powers, China, India, and so forth, also had a great sense of their own exceptionalism, a great sense of entitlement, and a great skepticism about multilateral institutions. What would that brave new world look like? What is the architecture of global institutions that we need to, in some ways, build upon the interdependence of the global economy? The third question was, in the sense that globalization has lifted millions out of poverty, but it has instituted new forms of exclusion, hierarchy, and subordination. Will these new forms of exclusion, hierarchy, and subordination produce a new form of ideological politics? We used to think that the old distinction between left and right will pass away with the ending of the Cold War. But in some senses, the politics of the privileged versus the politics of the have-nots continues to remain a dominant theme. How will this be articulated in the new world? Right? Fourth, and perhaps most immediately, it is often said that the international relations, the state of the world, is more like a Hobbesian state of nature. There isn't a single sovereign that can command the allegiance of all the global citizens in the world. In some ways, the world has become even more Hobbesian, because one of the things the 20th century has taught us is what we might call the strength of weakness. The capacity of small groups, small states, to bring about serious dislocations in the international system. Much of our paradigm of world politics is premised upon matching power for power, great powers matching great powers in terms of economic strength, military strength, and diplomatic finesse. But how do we deal with a world in which small groups, terrorist groups, other political movements, small nations can inflict incalculable damages on the architecture of the world? This is a new, it requires a new paradigm in thinking about how power operates in the international system. And fifth and finally, will the new technological changes that we are experiencing, both in their positive and negative effects, call for a new form of planetary consciousness? And are our politics and institutions geared to producing that kind of planetary consciousness? Whether it be the issue of global warming, whether it be the issue of bioengineering and a post-human future, as it were. Right? Do we have the ethical, moral, political, institutional paradigms to deal with these challenges? Now, these are all large questions. Not all of them are going to be answered either today or tomorrow. But I think they are the backdrop against which you can see many of the panels in this conclave. And we have two speakers who, more than anybody in the world today, any set of intellectuals in the world today, can help at least help us come to terms with some of the elements that go into answering these questions. I'll first introduce Professor Francis Fukuyama, who needs no introduction. Arguably, he's the world's preeminent public intellectual. He has, I think, he's unique amongst the world's prominent thinkers in having been at the forefront of every single important debate in the last 20 years. The nature of ideological conflict, the impact of science and technology on our human future, the nature of American power, the architecture of global institutions. There isn't a single issue which you can discuss in this world without referencing Francis Fukuyama, and I think that's all that needs to be said in introduction. He's otherwise professor at SAIS, Johns Hopkins, but I think his intellectual contributions overwhelm any institutional affiliation we might give. And if Francis Fukuyama has been at the forefront of every intellectual debate, Chandran Nair, founder and CEO of the Global Institute of Tomorrow, has been everywhere, so to speak. He's the founder for the Global Institute for Tomorrow, one of the most innovative think tanks in the world that in a sense matches thought and action in a range of countries and tries to, as it were, come to terms with these global problems, not at the level of philosophy of history, not from a stratospheric point of view, but in terms of how they organically emerge from the struggles, contradictions, and conflicts that are happening on the ground. And I think this combination will make for a very special panel. So may I invite Professor Fukuyama to deliver his address.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Mehta. I'm really delighted to be invited here to India by India Today. This is one of the most exciting countries in the world, and it's really a great privilege for me to be able to speak here and to witness the changes that are going on. The theme for the talk is the end of history or a brave new future. What I'm going to suggest to you is that these are not necessarily alternative choices. But let me simply outline what I would like to do in my talk today. First, I would simply like to represent the thesis that I laid out in the end of history, because it has been, I think, somewhat misunderstood over the past almost 20 years since it was first articulated. And then it was a question, as Dr. Mehta said, it was not an assertion. And I want to talk about 4 important ways in which the thesis may either be challenged or may have to be modified by developments that have happened since it was initially articulated at the end of the 1980s. The first has to do with the challenge, in a sense, of Islamic ideology. The second has to do with the problem of democracy at an international level. The third has to do with the problem of weak states, governance, and poverty. And the final issue has to do with the question of technology and the way that technology itself can be a challenge to the concept of the end of history. So let me go through all of those in sequence. What was the original thesis of the end of history that was stated in 1989? Well, first of all, it was a thesis about modernization. Prior to that point, for the 150 years through the end of the Cold War, I think most progressive intellectuals around the world actually believed that there would be an end of history. They believed that history was progressive, it had a meaning over time, but that the end point of history would be some form of a communist or socialist utopia. And my argument back in the 1980s was that given the way that events were shaping up in the world, it didn't look like that was going to happen, that the end point of history would not be communism, it would be some form of what the Marxists called bourgeois liberal democracy and some form of market economy, and that really seemed to be the goal towards which the development of institutions was heading. And actually that's one of the reasons that it was actually the Marxists that understood the thesis the best. They didn't like the conclusion, but they didn't get hung up on misinterpretation of what was meant by this concept of the end of history. Now, I think that in general it is undeniable that modernization is a coherent process and that virtually everybody around the world wants to live in a modernized society. You don't have to take my word for it. I think you simply look at the behavior of states that want development, and you look at the way that people vote with their feet. Every year there are millions of people living in less developed countries that are desperate to get into more developed countries, to Europe, to Japan, to the United States, because they want better health care, they want opportunities, they want the kinds of individual freedom that comes from life in a developed country. And so I think any kind of nostalgia for more traditional ways of life, although there's a clear spiritual gap that exists in modern liberal democracies, without a doubt, I think that very few people on balance would trade that for life in countries that are corrupt, are poor, have bad institutions, and do not offer their citizens opportunities. And so that's the basic reality. And in fact, if you look at the world as a whole, I think the modernization story is still very much the dominant one in global politics today. We focus on troubled areas like the Middle East, but the reality is that the two largest countries in the world, China and India, are also among the world's fastest growing and the most rapidly modernizing. As has been referred to earlier today, this process of globalization has pulled millions, hundreds of millions of people out of poverty as those two economies and others in East Asia and other parts of the world develop. And in fact, this process of modernization is happening on a much faster scale in the late modernizers than it did in the early ones. What took Britain and the United States 100 to 150 years to accomplish in East Asia has been accomplished in the space of just 40 or 50 years. And so it is actually a remarkable repetition of the pattern of development that is spreading outside of the West where it first took place. Now, there are a number of important questions to be asked. Obviously, China poses a different authoritarian model of modernization, and the question is whether liberal democracy will eventually emerge as China becomes richer, develops a more complex civil society, develops a middle class with property and with interest and a stake in the way that they are governed. I don't know the answer to this, but I think that there is a certain amount of evidence that suggests that as you develop materially, you also develop demands for political participation, for good government, which only can be guaranteed, I would say, in the long run, by a system that permits some degree of accountability to the citizens that the government is trying to serve. There's an inherent problem in authoritarian government, no matter how technocratically competent, that in the long run there is no guarantee that that government will ultimately stay uncorrupt or will meet the real needs, the changing needs of the society that it serves. And therefore, I think that there is a functional importance to democracy, to democratic accountability that China, as well as other fast-developing countries, will ultimately face. Now, the problem, obviously, is that the world is now bifurcated between a part that is developing rapidly and successfully and a part that is stuck in a certain sense. And that includes, although all of the world has been growing, fortunately, in the last few years, sub-Saharan Africa, many parts of the Middle East, many parts of Latin America have been either stuck or have moved backwards in terms of economic and social development over the past generation. And the question is, as a whole, is the world going to, is this simply a transitional arrangement, or does this reflect, in some sense, a permanent reflection of the cultural capabilities of different parts of the world to modernize? This is, in a sense, the thesis of my former teacher, Samuel Huntington. In his thesis about the clash of civilizations, he's argued that the fundamental differences between countries will remain despite the level of modernization that takes place, and that culture will remain the ultimate barrier and source of conflict between these different parts of the world. And I guess would argue that this is not the case, because there are, in fact, powerful unifying forces that proceed as a result of the modernization process itself, and that certain institutions, respect for individual rights, democracy, accountable political systems, the notion of equality, including women's equality, these are not simply the cultural projections of Western values that came out of the Western Enlightenment, but are in fact universal values that may have been uncovered in the West first, but will spread to the rest of the world because they actually have relevance to the lives of people that live there. An example would be modern natural science. Modern natural science, the technique of modern natural science was developed by Bacon and Descartes in the West at a certain period in the early modern history of Europe, but is now a universal possession. And my argument would be that democracy and other institutions, the equal respect for human rights is very much of the same, is the same kind of phenomenon. And I would say that India, your country, is perhaps the best illustration of that. If you look at the cultural conditions that many people have argued were necessary for democracy to take off or to sink roots, India meets almost none of them. It is a very, in a way, a divided country, ethnically, linguistically, religiously, in social caste terms, and yet democracy has functioned in this country in a way that I can scarcely imagine Indian development taking place without the kind of democratic institutions that you have developed here. And so although Indian modern democracy was not invented in India, it seems to me it has taken extremely deep roots in this country because it works. It is a system that can accommodate the kind of ethnic and social diversity that modern societies inevitably generate. Now, let me run through the problems quickly. First has to do with Islam and the Muslim world in general, which has been an exception to the general pattern of modernization. There are Muslim democracies. Indonesia and Turkey have developed democratic institutions, but in the Arab world particularly, there has been a democratic deficit. None of these countries, with the exception of those living off of oil rents and those in Southeast Asia, have moved on to a sustained high-growth economic development path. And in certain parts of the Muslim world, there's been the development of a radical Islamist ideology. And I want to be careful. This is not, in my view, a projection of the religion Islam. This is a very specific ideology that grows out of very specific circumstances. But this ideology is profoundly anti-modern and illiberal, and is the source of a lot of the jihadist terrorism that both India and other countries have suffered from. And so the question is this a permanent exception to the overall pattern of modernization, or is this explained by shorter-term factors, and will this part of the world eventually get with the larger program that has been occurring in Asia and Europe and North America? I would say that, first of all, I doubt the problem in the Muslim world really is a cultural one at heart, or is one that is due to the religion Islam. I think that, in fact, radical Islamism is understood best as, in a sense, a disease or a problem that is engendered by the modernization process itself. That is to say, traditional Islam is one that establishes identities, it ascribes identities in a very traditional way, but that is not the source of terrorism or the kind of violent ideology that we have seen grown in parts of the Middle East. It is actually those people that have been transported either through living in migrant communities in Western Europe, or those that have undergone a rapid transition to urban life where they're connected to the global world, where modernization comes to visit them in the form of satellite television or the internet or connection to the global media. It is those people that are the most susceptible to recruitment into violent jihadist terrorist circles. And in a sense, we are dealing, I think, with a problem that is quite familiar from the history of Europe and the development of extremist ideologies in Europe in the 20th century. That transition from a traditional to a modern world, especially when it is extremely rapid, as it has been for many people in Muslim countries over the past generation, generates alienation and loss of identity. And I believe that in many ways, modern Islamism is an answer to that basic question, who am I, that connects people that are separated by geography and distance to a global ummah, that explains to them, as extremist nationalism did to Germans and Italians in the 20th century, who they are in a rapidly changing world. And therefore, this does not mean that this is a safe phenomenon. Obviously, in the 20th century in Europe, it led to war and destruction, and it is a dangerous ideology now, but it is not an unfamiliar one, and it is one that is, in a way, thrown up by the modernization process itself. I ultimately believe that this challenge is not as serious as the one that was posed by communism, because, among other things, it is not an ideology that appeals to people that are not culturally Muslim to begin with. And I think the contradictions of living in a society dominated by a clerical hierarchy, it is simply not compatible with the kinds of institutions that are needed to live well and to develop in a globalized world. And so I think that the challenge is ultimately one that will be overcome, but it is obviously one we will have to watch closely. Second issue has to do with the democratic deficit at an international level. We know very well how to create democratic institutions in these stovepipes that we call nation states. We've had a couple of hundred years of experience in developing institutions and mechanisms of accountability. What we do not have is an adequate set of institutions at an international level that provide both effective collective action and effective accountability, and therefore legitimacy when countries need to work together, as is absolutely necessary in the contemporary world. Now, this has become a particular problem given the position of the United States in the global stage. The United States today spends as much on its military as the entire rest of the world combined, and it has a kind of global reach that is political, military, economic, and cultural that engenders, I think, an inherent pushback and resentment because of the fundamental lack of reciprocity in its relations with the rest of the world. And this is, I think, one of the fundamental cleavage points in global politics today, the feeling that there is no accountability for a hegemonic power that often makes mistakes, exercises poor judgment, even if its intentions are justifiable. And the institutions that we have at a global level are not adequate to deal with this problem. The United Nations is a noble effort, but it was designed as ultimately a weak institution that gives veto power to essentially the five victors of World War II. And I think all of the proposals for UN reform that are on the table increase its legitimacy at the expense of its ability to make decisive action for collective security purposes. And I think one of the great challenges that really exists in the world today is to construct a new set of institutions, not displacing the United Nations, but adding to what the United Nations provides already, that are able to deliver both effective and legitimate cooperation between countries in a way that simply does not exist at the present moment. And in a sense, it is, we were told a lot in the 1990s about the death of sovereignty, the death of the nation state. I'm afraid that that death was announced a little bit prematurely, because there's one thing that nation states can do that no other regional or supranational or international organization can provide, and that is the ability to provide that legitimate monopoly of power that is able to enforce rules. And until such time that international organizations can do that, we are going to be living in a world that ultimately will rest on nation states, despite the internet and despite globalization. And so we somehow have to reconcile the need for national power with the need for legitimate international cooperation. The third issue has to do with governance and development. There's a nice story that you can tell about how increasing per capita GDP will create pressure for democracy. I suggested that that may be the case in China's future. The problem is that in some sense there's a chicken that comes before the egg that comes before the chicken. You need good institutions to get to rapid economic development. And I would say that if you look for the single reason why countries in sub-Saharan Africa or in Latin America or other parts of the developing world remain poor, it is primarily because of the lack of good, strong, capable public institutions that can provide public goods and services to their citizens. That is the cause of poverty. That is the cause of lack of development. That is the cause, ultimately, of institutions. Before you have development, you have to have an effective state. One of the great advantages, I think, that East Asia as a region had was that they began their modernization process with strong nation states and good bureaucracies. I think that India and China have been able to take off as a result of policy changes, again, because they both were blessed with strong state institutions, perhaps a little bit too strong or too intrusive in some cases, but nonetheless states that were able to maintain order and produce basic public goods. But this is something we cannot take for granted in many other parts of the developing world. And the ability to help countries that have highly corrupt or incompetent state services is a challenge that we are not very good at meeting. It is something that the World Bank and other donors in the international scene have been trying to wrestle with, I think, with only very mixed success. And that realm of failed and weak states is really, in a sense, the defining characteristic of life in this arc of instability that stretches from North Africa through sub-Saharan Africa, through the Middle East, into Central Asia and parts of South Asia. I would draw the boundary line at the Indian border for this region, but that is a region that is characterized by state weakness, transnational actors, militias come political parties, and in that part of the world, international relations and the character of international relations is profoundly different. Final issue has to do with technology. Now, in the past, the growth of the modern world has been completely dependent on technology, and there are many technologies that, in fact, I believe have supported the spread of democracy, the greater flow of information that is brought about by the IT revolution, I think, has profoundly democratizing impacts. But there is no guarantee that technology per se or the development of technology will serve human purposes, will be used for moral purposes, or the like. We have been fortunate up till now that technological advance has been able to solve a lot of the problems that technology itself produces, but it is not guaranteed to do that in the future. The chief issue that many people today worry about, global warming, is a good example of that. It is not clear that there are technological solutions if some of the more dire predictions about global warming are correct. Weapons of mass destruction is another case where you've had this profound democratization of the means to inflict tremendous violence on other people. And it is not clear that the control mechanisms that the global community can muster to prevent the spread of this kind of technology will be sufficient to prevent their use. Biotechnology is a complicated threat because the good things and the bad things are profoundly mixed, and so it is very hard to say that you don't want new genetic medicines that may help us to live longer, to cure disease, and the like, but it also raises very profound ethical questions about social control and the possibility of social engineering using a kind of technology that is incomparably more sophisticated than the techniques for social engineering that we experienced in the past. And so these, I think, are the broad areas of challenge, and I will tell you right now, I don't have answers to any of them. I think that in many respects, if we do not come up with answers to each of these, of a way of integrating people that are alienated, of improving governance both at a national level in poor countries and in developed countries as well, if we do not have a means of developing better international institutions and a way of putting technology under the control of society so it serves human ends, then the modernization story may well end in a global disaster. And I wish I could confidently predict to you that this will not happen, but I'm afraid I can't, because I am not, I may be a historicist, but I'm not a Marxist. I don't believe that there is an inevitable unfolding of a historical mechanism. There's a lot of contingency, choice. You need statesmanship. You need participation by democratic publics. And you need a globe in which individuals feel empowered to actually take control of the development of their own lives through politics. And that is the world I hope will emerge, but is one that I think is challenged. So thank you very much for your attention today.
Well, one of the things about the future is that we will make it, and so may I now invite somebody who's in the process of making it, Mr. Chandran Nair.
Good afternoon. Good morning, everyone. I'm not going to take on Francis's sentiments about Islam and things like that, because we could be here all day. Just to start off on a light note, I mean, in terms of the end of history, if India doesn't win today, that would be the end of history. I mean, seriously. I'm not Sri Lankan, but, you know, India's got to win. Sri Lanka's through. So that's really important.